At the turn of the 20th century, the world was obsessed with a single, magnificent dream: human flight. The greatest scientific minds, backed by massive government budgets and elite universities, were locked in a high-stakes race to conquer the skies. Newspapers wrote glowing headlines about steam-powered flying machines, heavy iron engines, and massive winged ships designed to float effortlessly through the clouds. Leading this elite race was Samuel Langley, the head of the Smithsonian Institution. Langley had received $50,000 from the United States War Department, a fortune at the time, to build a piloted flying machine called the Aerodrome. He had access to the nation's best engineers, top-tier metallurgy, and advanced labs. And then there were two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, Orville and Wilbur Wright. They had no college degrees. They had no government grants. They had no financial backers or scientific prestige. They ran a modest neighborhood shop where they assembled and repaired bicycles. When word got out about how these two self-taught mechanics intended to solve the problem of flight, the scientific establishment did not just ignore them, they openly laughed at them. The world's leading experts called their approach absurd, dangerous, and fundamentally unscientific. They mocked the brothers for wasting their time on an idea that defied every established rule of engineering. Yet, on a freezing, wind-swept beach in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, in December 1903, those two bicycle mechanics flew. While Samuel Langley's multi-thousand-dollar machine crumpled like a paper toy and sank straight into the Potomac River, the Wright brothers unlocked the secret to human aviation. So, what did the Wright brothers do that made the entire scientific world laugh? They built a machine that was deliberately, calculatedly, and completely unstable. To understand why this idea sounded insane to the leading minds of the 1900s, you first have to understand how everyone else viewed the air. At the time, the world's most respected engineers treated a flying machine like a boat in the sky. They believed the primary goal of aviation was total, unyielding stability. An ocean liner does not require the captain to constantly balance the ship from left to right. The hull is designed to stay upright automatically. Early aviation pioneers assumed a flying machine should work the exact same way. They believed you should build a giant, heavy frame with massive wings that held itself perfectly level in the air. If a gust of wind knocked the plane sideways, the machine's built-in symmetry was supposed to push it back into place automatically. The human inside was envisioned merely as a passenger, or a simple driver who turned a rudder to steer left or right, just like a ship captain. Samuel Langley, Hiram Maxim, and Octave Chanute all built giant, inherently stable machines. But every time these massive, rigid contraptions caught a sudden gust of wind, they spiraled completely out of control and slammed into the ground. The wind always won. When the Wright brothers looked at the problem, they saw something entirely different. They realized that the air was not a calm, predictable body of water. The atmosphere was a chaotic, violent, ever-shifting ocean of invisible currents, thermals, and sudden downdrafts. Trying to build an inherently stable machine in a chaotic atmosphere was like trying to freeze an ocean wave in place. Wilbur and Orville realized that absolute stability was a trap. Instead of building a ship that fought the wind, they needed a machine that could yield, flex, and adapt to the wind instantly. They needed a machine that was inherently unstable, relying entirely on human reflexes to stay aloft. Where did two men without an engineering degree get such a radical, counterintuitive insight? From bicycles. Every single day in their Dayton shop, the Wright brothers watched people ride bicycles. A bicycle is a masterpiece of dynamic instability. Standing still, a two-wheeled bicycle falls over instantly. It cannot balance on its own. It is inherently unstable. Yet a human rider sits on a bicycle, senses a slight tilt to the left, shifts their body weight, and turns the handlebars just a fraction of an inch, and brings the machine back into balance smoothly. Through continuous active human control, an unstable machine becomes an extension of the human body. The scientific establishment believed that a flying machine should carry a human. The Wright brothers realized the human had to become the flying machine. When the brothers presented their idea to other aviation experimenters, the reaction was condescending amusement. Top engineers argued that forcing a pilot to balance a moving machine in mid-air in 3 dimensions while traveling 30 miles per hour was a death sentence. They argued that human reaction times were simply too slow. The machine had to balance itself, or the pilot would crash and die. The experts told them that human control was a dead end. The Wright brothers ignored the experts and doubled down on instability. To prove their theory, they realized they had to master control in 3 distinct axes: pitch, yaw, and roll. Pitch, moving the nose up or down, was relatively easy. Yaw, turning the nose left or right with a rudder, was well understood from ships. The real mystery, the wall that no human had ever crossed, was roll. How do you stop a flying machine from tipping over on its side and plummeting to Earth when a gust of wind strikes one wing? Once again, the brothers looked at the world differently. Wilbur was idling in their bicycle shop one evening, nervously twisting a long, rectangular cardboard box in his hands. As he twisted opposite ends of the box in different directions, a lightning bolt of realization hit him. He didn't need heavy mechanical hinges or rigid iron joints to balance the wings. He could make the wings themselves twist. By using a system of thin pulleys and cables, the pilot could pull a lever that twisted, or warped, the wooden edges of the flexible wings. The wing on the right would twist to catch more air and lift up, while the wing on the left would twist to catch less air and drop down. The Wright brothers had just invented wing warping, the direct ancestor of the modern aileron used on every commercial airliner on Earth today. They didn't just invent a theoretical system. They built an unstable glider and tested it themselves on the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk. While the elite scientists remained safe in their dry laboratories running mathematical calculations, Orville and Wilbur strapped themselves onto the wooden frames of their gliders, risking their lives hundreds of times to train their brains and muscles to respond to the unpredictable air. They suffered brutal crashes, broke bones, and wrecked dozens of prototypes. They treated flight not as a passive mechanical problem, but as a discipline, like learning to ride a bicycle or play an instrument. By 1902, their unstable glider was working, but they hit another massive wall. The mathematical tables published by the world's most famous scientists, calculations for lift and air drag used by every engineer in Europe and America, were wrong. When the brothers tried to use the official scientific data, their gliders failed to lift properly. Rather than giving up, the brothers built a small, 6-foot wooden box with a fan powered by a single-cylinder gas engine. It was one of the world's first true wind tunnels. Inside that crude wooden box, they tested over 200 different wing shapes and airfoils, measuring air pressure with delicate instruments they handcrafted out of bicycle spokes and scrap metal. They threw out the textbooks written by the world's leading professors and wrote their own mathematical tables. They discovered that thin, curved airfoils generated vastly more lift with less drag than the thick, flat shapes the scientific community was using. Equipped with their custom wind tunnel data, their 3-axis control system, and their unstable airframe, they built a tiny, custom 12-horsepower engine and carved 2 wooden propellers by hand. On the morning of December 17, 1903, at Kitty Hawk, Orville Wright lay flat on his stomach on the lower wing of the flyer. The wind was howling at over 20 miles per hour. Under the old scientific theory of absolute stability, launching a lightweight machine into those turbulent winds was suicide. Orville released the wire. The machine accelerated down the wooden track. It lifted into the air. For 12 incredible seconds, the machine darted up and down, pitching violently as Orville fought the wind, constantly flexing the wings and adjusting the elevators with his hips and hands. The machine was wildly unstable, wobbling through the sky like a newly hatched bird. It was ugly. It was erratic. It looked terrifying. But it was fully, completely controlled by a human being. The flyer covered 120 feet before settling back onto the sand. It was the first time in human history that a powered, heavier-than-air machine had taken off under its own power, flown under complete control, and landed safely without crashing. When news of the achievement reached the public, the scientific establishment was in complete denial. The New York Times had published an article just 9 weeks earlier claiming that building a flying machine would require the combined, continuous effort of mathematicians and engineers for another 1 to 10 million years. The U.S. War Department, embarrassed by the catastrophic failure of Langley's expensive aerodrome, refused to even come look at the Wright brothers' machine for years. Europeans called it a hoax. Major American newspapers refused to send reporters to Ohio to watch them fly in a pasture called Huffman Prairie, convinced that 2 bicycle mechanics could never solve a problem that had stumped Isaac Newton's intellectual heirs. For almost 5 years after their first flight, the world refused to believe them. Finally, in 1908, Wilbur Wright traveled to France to give a public demonstration in front of the elite European Aviation Club, the very men who had publicly mocked their claims. Wilbur calmly climbed into his machine, started the engine, and took off. While the French pilots were used to rigid machines that could barely lumber in a straight line, Wilbur banked the Wright flyer hard into the sky, twisting its flexible wings, making tight, effortless circles, figure eights, and elegant swoops over the crowd. He didn't just fly, he danced in the sky. The French audience erupted into wild cheers. The elite engineers who had laughed at them for a decade wept openly in the fields. One of France's top aviators, René Gasnier, stood in the crowd, shook his head, and publicly announced, "We have been scooped. We do not exist." Consider what would not exist today if Orville and Wilbur Wright had listened to the experts and chased absolute stability. Without the fundamental concept of 3-axis control and dynamic instability, modern aviation simply could not exist. Every modern fighter jet, from the F-22 Raptor to the F-35, is designed to be so wildly aerodynamic and unstable that a human cannot fly it without computer assistance. They are intentionally built unstable because instability is what gives an aircraft hypersonic maneuverability, agility, and speed. The computer flight control systems in a billion-dollar stealth jet are doing the exact same thing Wilbur Wright was doing with his hips on a beach in 1903, continuously fighting the wind, adjusting the surfaces, and keeping an unstable machine in the sky. Every time a commercial airliner banks smoothly over a city to make a turn, it is using the exact principles of wing warping that Wilbur twisted out of a cardboard box in a Dayton bicycle shop. So, what did we actually miss about the story of the Wright brothers? We missed the profound truth that real innovation often looks like complete foolishness to the people who think they know everything. The scientific establishment looked at the sky and saw a dangerous ocean that required a massive, rigid fortress to survive. The Wright brothers looked at the sky, remembered what it felt like to ride a bicycle down a bumpy road, and realized that to conquer the air, you didn't need to build a fortress. You just had to learn how to fall, balance, and catch yourself before you hit the ground.